Hello, I'm Mark Mason. I'm going to be talking to you today about one of two research projects that I'm currently engaged in that use knowledge from psychotherapy and counselling to examine the relationship between the lawyer and the client and to look at the process of lawyering. The project that I'm talking about today is one that looks at the way that solicitors use a model of supervision that's more common in the world of psychotherapy and counselling. So in order to explain what this research is about, I'm going to go through the meaning of supervision for therapists and then the meaning of supervision for lawyers before I talk a bit about the benefits that therapists get from supervision and the potential benefits that lawyers might get too, that I'm going to be looking for in this research. So starting then with what therapists mean by supervision, there isn't really a uniform definition, but there's general sense across the profession or across the professions and across research as to the sort of thing it is and the sort of aims that it meets. One thing that there seems to be a consensus on is that it's certainly relational. So, for example, we can see in this quote from Watkins that he puts the relationship between supervisor and supervisee at the centre of this work and says that it appears to be the necessary ingredient to the making, doing and being of the supervision process itself, and seemingly facilitates or potentiates whatever takes place within that process. So the relationality of it is very important for psychotherapists. If we look at what the UKCP, the UK Council for Psychotherapy, state the aim of supervision as being, we see here that it's about promoting reflective and informed practice and underpinning and supporting best practice. So as well as being relational, we see it's reflective and focused on best practice with benefits to service users. Moving on to what the other accrediting body, the BACP, the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, say about supervision. Firstly, it's worth noting that within their ethical framework, which is only 27 pages long, around 2 pages of that is dedicated purely to supervision, as well as there being discussion of supervision in other aspects of the framework itself. So it's clearly quite important. And here, as well as it being reflective and focused on best practice, as we heard before, there's again an emphasis on it being relational and at depth, and on outcomes which presumably include client benefit, that it's private, safe and contained, and clarification that it's much more than case management and is ideally to be independent of line management. And those are important when we consider the comparison between the two types. They also say for supervisee, in their guidance to supervisees, that they should be looking for supervision to be normative, formative and restorative, so supporting and challenging on a personal basis as well as those other two. It's clearly very important to the BACP because they require accredited members or members who are working towards accreditation to have at least an hour and a half of supervision a month, more if they've got a fuller caseload, and members should ideally be having 1.5 hours, but should at least be having adequate supervision. So there's an expectation that there will be some supervision. And supervision, as you can see from the description of it, as sort of 1.5 hours and the ratios that students have to deal with, is considered to be an event. It's not just a more general presence of a supervisor. So taking all of this together, then what we have is a process which is relational and reflective, normative, formative and restorative. It's private, safe and contained, with a concern for best practice and outcomes. And importantly, it's much more than case management, and it's independent from line management. And from my own experience of it, I would say that it's more akin to therapy than any sort of managerial process. It borrows a lot from the techniques of therapy. It's probably also worth noting at this stage that whilst there are lots of methods and models of psychotherapy and counselling, that is mirrored in the way that supervision is carried out too. There are different ways of doing it. What then do lawyers mean when they talk about supervision? And this is something that's harder to pin down, harder to find, and in some ways that seems to be something that's taken for granted, and the sort of common usage in language of the word supervision is what lawyers seem to be adopting without really examining it further. Here I'm not talking about SRA, supervision of firms, which is a technical term for part of their regulatory process. I'm talking specifically about individual supervision. So if we look very briefly at some sources, then we see that the Law Society here, so the Law Society, the representative body here, sees that supervision means management. In that first line, they explicitly say supervision means management of people in their activities, and the list of the benefits of it mirror that sentiment. There is mention of its relationship to learning and development, but really supervision is seen as a place where those needs can be identified rather than necessarily met. The Code of Conduct from the Solicitors Regulation Authority, the regulator, again use the terms interchangeably, where you supervise or manage others, and again see it as a matter of general management, file review and risk management. It's probably worth mentioning as well, the SRA mentions supervision in the context of training, of course, and in the context of registered foreign lawyers, and what they require from a supervisor is someone who has been in practice for over 3 years. So it's an experience criteria rather than an additional training criteria. Lexel, the accreditation standard from the Law Society for best practice, again sees it as a very managerial aspect of the work, and includes things like checking data generated by file reviews, being made aware of high-risk matter starts. So again, it's largely line management and case management there. But without dwelling any further on that difference, it's perhaps more interesting to start to look at what the benefits might be of supervision. So first, for psychotherapists, it's a widely practiced and an evolving practice, and as we saw that it's a compulsory practice for at least one of the accrediting bodies. So what do psychotherapists get out of this practice? So there's some research, a small body of research on its relationship to positive client outcomes. There's a stronger understanding of psychotherapy supervision in relation to client safety. It's very clearly seen by the profession as something that contributes to safe practice, safe and ethical practice. Perhaps more interesting and more complex is the way it relates to the phenomena of countertransference. So transference can be broadly seen as, it's in some ways a slightly contested terms depending on modality of psychotherapy practice, but it can generally be seen as the way that the client experiences the relationship with the therapist, and how that's influenced by their own psychological structures and most importantly their own past experience. So it's how they displace and they bring things into that relationship that don't really belong to that relationship, don't belong to the here and now of that relationship, and come from another experience in the client's life. Countertransference, again, is even more contested as a term and as a practice, but broadly speaking, it's what the therapist brings in a similar way. So in that way, it has two elements. It's directly that is what the psychotherapist is, or the counsellor is bringing from their own experience and displacing onto the client-therapist relationship. But it's also the therapist's reaction to the client's transferential processes, and in that way, it can be quite a useful thing to practice with. So in looking at the way these processes are dealt with in supervision, it seems to be the relational nature and the empathic nature of the supervisory relationship that facilitates looking at transference and counter-transference. And there the supervisor will be noticing, for example, the extent to which the therapist identifies with the client, sort of notice any blind spots the client may have, and notice the extent to which blind spots the therapist may have, and notice the extent to which the therapist may be exhibiting sort of behavioural or emotional disturbances or unusual features. So it's considered to be a really important part of that work. Supervision is also considered to be a reflective process, so it's to encourage an active reflection on the part of the therapist. And one particularly important area of work, supervision is used across the board of broad range of therapists' work, but it's in trauma work that it seems to have a particularly strong effect, where, as Etherington describes it, there can be empathic strain and empathic stretching, leading to withdrawal and enmeshment and disequilibrium in the therapist. And any sort of empathic work is seen to put the practitioner at risk of secondary or vicarious trauma. And the risk is to schemas in the therapist of safety and dependency and trust, and power, esteem and intimacy, according to Taylor and research by Taylor and Furlonger. According to West's research, supervision allows three things to happen. One, it allows the therapist to sustain empathy. Two, to continue their provision, particularly of a therapeutic environment, particularly for uncooperative or difficult clients, and also, finally, to minimise the impact of these things on the therapist. But more generally, the research shows that it's seen to be protective against secondary or vicarious trauma. In terms of what it can do for solicitors then, or for lawyers, so I would say that it can contribute to all of the same aims to a degree. Whilst lawyers may not have the same need to use transference in their work, to use the unnoticed counter-transference in their work, I would argue that it's still important for them to be aware of the processes that are going on. And that's research that's something I'm investigating in another research project that's a bit on hold at the moment due to lockdown. So I think that's an important and interesting feature of this. I think vicarious trauma is also something that's going to be quite important in these interviews. So vicarious trauma has been found to occur in solicitors. So, for example, in research in Australia, they've been found to experience avoidance, intrusion and hyperarousal, particularly in criminal work, that lead to depression, stress, cognitive changes in relation to safety and intimacy. In the recently published book, published by the Legal Aid Group, by Flack and Francis, entitled Vicarious Trauma in the Legal Profession, really good to see that sort of work is being published. They raise the possibility of individual and group supervision alongside things like peer support and debriefing as potential preventative measures for vicarious trauma. So once they talk about it largely as an aspiration, the research that I'm hoping to do aims to look at this, look at an instance where it's already happening, So what my research will be doing is interviewing a small number of solicitors who are already using a psychotherapeutic model of supervision to support their work. And it's currently being sort of referred to and branded as family law supervision. So it is with family law solicitors that this is being carried out at the moment, or the instance that I'm looking at is being carried out. So we've sort of seen that in what I've said already, that the two cultures view supervision very differently. So what I'm interested in is how the benefits might cross over, and why solicitors are drawn to this model, and what they get out of it, as well as possibly getting indications on bigger questions around transference and counter-transference that can feed into the research programme that I'm engaged in more broadly. So hopefully that's what these interviews will do. In the process of recruiting participants now, who knows, maybe by the time we meet, there will be some feedback from that already. I've missed doing this in a room where I'd already been getting feedback from you all, so I'm really looking forward to discussing this research with you all very soon.